Welcome to Reformation 2017, Re-fermenting the Church, Part 2A. My name is Ron Rood. After exploring medieval Catholic theology, what Martin Luther and the Reformers did to try to change it, and several important Lutheran nuances in the Protestant world, we now move into Part 2 and are asking the question, what worldview-altering paradigm shifts have been happening during these past 500 years since Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in Wittenberg, Germany on October 31st, a Saturday in 1517, that might be re-fermenting the Christian faith in a good way, that is, making a new brew for our time. I asked my campus ministry students at the University of Arizona, where I serve as their campus pastor, to list significant changes that have occurred in their particular fields of study during the past 5 centuries. We have religious studies majors, biochemistry, geology, psychology, computer science, astronomy majors, engineers, lots of very smart people. Well, the list they came up with was long. The modern world has many complexities and layers, and there have been many advances as well as many regressions. But we also wondered whether anything foundational about the Christian faith had shifted too during these last 500 years. One arena has to do with various social and political and economic realities that have changed since Martin Luther's time, some of which were unheard of in 1517, and others, while very common then, are pretty much banished in our day. And indeed, there are some historical events that have changed us forever. We will look at these in this Part 2A. For example, patriarchy. Patriarchy was the rule not only in Martin Luther's time and in much of our American history, but also in biblical times. However, today, among thoughtful people at least, including those Christians who are thoughtful, patriarchy has been pretty much dethroned. Only the very blind cannot see how damaging male dominion has been, and what a blessing fullness of life and fullness of opportunity and fullness of responsibility for all has become. So how significant is this transformation, we might ask? Of course, the dismantling of patriarchy has also helped foster a trend toward equality in many other areas too, including interracial relationships and marriages. And lately in many parts of the world, including the United States, toward marriage equality and fullness of life. And in some places, including ELCA Lutheranism, that I'm a part of, fullness of ministry for gay and lesbian and transgender couples, individuals, and their families. I think it is fair to ask how the Christian community has hindered in some cases, but also helped in others, these welcomed transformations in church and society. But the overall issue is this, patriarchy. And this has been pretty much discredited. The abolishment of human slavery is another transformation. This scourge was also generally accepted as a given in both biblical and medieval times, and among a majority of white people in our nation's history. For centuries, white people in Europe and in the United States and in the South American countries kidnapped and stole the lives of millions of African women, men, and children. In the United States of America, 10 of our presidents, many of them with some pretty notable names, acted as racial terrorists and perpetrators of evil through all or most of their lives. These men and their wives and families were often honorable in other arenas of life, even brilliant. But in this personal and public arena, their minds and hearts were under the lordship of demonic forces, causing them to be kidnappers, human traffickers, and murderers of body, mind, and soul. Ordinary citizens, too, obeyed laws that were unjust and anti-God, or they looked the other way. Andrew Johnson, who took on the presidency on April 15, 1865, after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, is probably one of our worst presidents ever. On the one hand, he came to be against slavery plantations because he felt they competed unfairly against poor whites, and he was pro-union, that is, anti-secessionist, even though his home state of Tennessee left the Union. But personally, Andrew Johnson hated black men, women, and children. And his unfortunate presidency had a lot to do with setting in motion the next 100 years of racism, discrimination, segregation, Jim Crow laws, lynching, the Ku Klux Klan, which began in his home state, and the structural racism that continues in our day. But at great, great cost, at least the slavery system itself has mostly been purged from daily and institutional life on this planet, and is no longer sanctioned by any society, government, or religion that claims to be civilized. Our species has traveled a long, hard road to get rid of this disgrace. So how has this transformation affected Christian theology, Reformation theology, and even biblical interpretations? Consider the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. A master of slaves shrewdly entrusts 3 of his slaves with 5, 2, and 1 talent, respectively. A talent is a sum of money. 2 slaves invest the talents and prosper the slave master's holdings. Matthew tells the parable in such a way that these 2 slaves are lifted up as good and trustworthy, models of faithfulness. Contrarily, the wicked and lazy slave who digs a hole in the ground and hides the slave master's money and ends up producing nothing for the system is portrayed as the anti-hero, the worthless slave. How many pastors, including myself, have preached this parable as a stewardship sermon, identifying the slave owner perhaps as the righteous one or even a divine figure in the parable, and encouraging our listeners to be like the 2 slaves who prosper what the master entrusted to them for the benefit of the slavery system? But wait a minute. Could there be vestiges of a slavery mentality still residing in me? What if the slaveholder is not the good guy in the parable, but rather the evil one? Where then might righteousness or even a Jesus figure dwell in this parable? Could the Jesus figure be the wicked and worthless slave, the oppressed soul who assertively sabotages the slavery system and refuses to play the slaveholder's intoxicating, toxic, and evil game, who is then cast out into outer darkness by the slave master with all the others, who have been cast out by the powers and principalities of this world? Might the point of the parable be, as Jesus told it, but obviously missed by the writer of Matthew's Gospel, that Jesus of Nazareth and Jesus the Christ resides with outcasts, with those labeled unworthy, and with those who day and night are cast out into outer darkness to suffer weeping and gnashing of teeth under the steel boot of injustice? But here's a question of biblical interpretation to ponder. In the year 2017, what do we do with biblical writers who may have gotten it wrong in their portrayal of Jesus' message? Can we even make that accusation? I would argue, yes. And then there is Nazism and the Holocaust. Certainly Hitler was vile beyond measure, along with Himmler, Eichmann, Goebbels, and others. The Nazi leadership was pure evil, including the SS, death camp commanders, propagandists, medical researchers, and bureaucrats. But in reality, ordinary German citizens, religious institutions, including Lutheran ones, and the news media swooned over the hyper-nationalism and patriotic rhetoric of the Nazis. They spoke respectfully about this evil and obeyed Hitler's insane orders. Citizens closed their eyes to truth and carried out the terror with chilling efficiency. In fact, we are told that many excelled in their tasks, with some even experiencing a palpable gratification while carrying out the butchery. This horror has certainly altered our view of humanity. But has it changed our view of God too? I think it has for many Jews who were the target of this insanity. Mary Doria Russell, author of a book called The Sparrow, observes in an interview what it means to be Jewish. She says, "When you convert to Judaism in a post-Holocaust world, you know 2 things for sure. One is that being Jewish can get you killed. The other is that God won't rescue you. The Holocaust changed Judaism's view of God, and many lost their faith. I wonder if it has affected Christianity too. Many Christians, including Lutherans, fell for Nazism. There is much to be ashamed of in the church. Bible scholars today certainly read anti-Jewish passages in the New Testament differently now. But Russell's observations, I think, go even deeper. Does God intervene? Does God help those in trouble? We know that Hitler used many actual quotations from Martin Luther in his invectives. Thankfully, in 1994, ELCA Lutherans finally repudiated the vile words that Martin Luther had said against Jews and their religion later in his life. These views should rightly be condemned. For me, the Holocaust has had a major influence on how I interpret many things in life, including parts of the Bible. For example, can Christians ever argue again that the Noah and the flood sequence is historical? And if it is, that the God of this story is praiseworthy? Thankfully, few current biblical scholars today consider this story to have actually happened. For one thing, no geology or geosciences department in any reputable university on the planet can find evidence of a flood of that magnitude taking place when humans were present on the earth. Floods occur naturally and seasonally in God's Tova garden, of course. Some even initially devastate plant and animal life, including human life. However, there never was a flood that, to quote Genesis 7:19-20, swelled so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered, covering them 15 cubits deep. The water certainly never rose higher than the 16,000-foot Mount Ararat in Turkey, let alone higher than the 29,000-foot Mount Everest in Nepal and Tibet. But the bigger problem is theological. Would the God of Judaism and Christianity deliberately massacre all moms and dads, grandmas and grandpas, and boys and girls of the species Homo sapiens, except one tiny clan belonging to Noah and his wife? Would this God destroy all plant and animal life on land except one male and one female of each species? Apparently fish were safe. Even if afterwards God promised never to do it again? Is God a God of genocide? A God of ecocide? The medieval church and even Luther and the Reformers seem to have accepted this view. But hasn't the past 500 years taught us that such a portrayal is more in line with the character of a Nazi death camp than with God? But if it is a parable rather than an historical account, parables usually have a point. So what then is the point or lesson of this parable? Might it be this? If we think we can get rid of evil by killing off a bunch of evil people, we had better think again. It seems that Noah and his kin, who were supposedly the righteous ones, got themselves into some pretty harmful and evil behaviors almost immediately. Or, what about the conquest of Canaan stories in the Bible? Was Canaan really meant to be Israel's promised land? Certainly God may have invited the homeless tribes of Israel after they escaped slavery in Egypt to come into the land of Canaan and live peacefully among peoples there as their guests, and maybe even eventually as full and equal citizens. But as the books of Joshua and Judges clearly state, did God order Israelite armies to demolish homes, devour cities, thieve away land and property, enslave non-Israelites, and carry out mass murder against countless women, men, and children? Or did a considerable amount of military propaganda, that is wood, straw, and manure, make it into the Bible too? Given the trail of blood by similar conquistadors over the past 500 years, might there be justification in questioning what medieval Christianity considered to be an acceptable element in the biblical narrative? And furthermore, if we take off the table any notion that the Israelites have a God-given right to ancient Palestine, how does this affect not only our reading of the biblical narrative, but current politics as well. I don't pretend to have a political solution, and the state of Israel certainly has a right to exist. But does it have a right to exist in Palestine? I wonder how history would have been different if instead of confiscating Palestinian lands from Palestinian families to become a homeland for the state of Israel, if instead half of Germany, in fact the best land in Germany, had been taken away from German families to become the state of Israel. Germany, not Palestine, was responsible for the murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, 3 million ethnic Poles, 8 million Russian soldiers, 14 million Russian civilians, 400,000 British soldiers and civilians, and 420,000 U.S. soldiers. Has the past 500 years of political history changed in any way how we look at the biblical narratives and the theologies and behaviors and decisions that come out of these narratives? I think so. And finally, economics. I don't know quite enough about economics to say too much here, other than the reality that at the time of Martin Luther, the following systems had not yet been invented: capitalism, Marxism, communism, globalization, state-run capitalism. These were unheard of in Luther's time. What are the benefits and what are the tribulations of each of these economic systems? Can the ecological destruction of these economic systems be justified, tolerated, mitigated? And do our Reformation theologies adequately address the complexities and impacts of these economic forces that we have created and are always trying to expand and spend trillions of dollars in military weaponry to defend? Does the doctrine of justification by grace through faith adequately address these forces, especially their destructive underbellies? In part 2, we are exploring major paradigm shifts that have taken place since the 16th century and wondering after 500 years whether it may be time for a new reformation, a recasting, a re-fermenting, not only of Christian practices, but of Christian theological foundations. In this part 2a, we have looked at various social, political, and economic transformations. Next, in part B, we will explore changes in technology and scientism.